By the time of Northcliffe's death, another great press baron was firmly established in British politics. He based himself here at his country house, Cherkley Court in Surrey. It would be the centre of a web of intrigue, plotting and fixing for the next 50 years.
Max Beaverbrook was the most powerful and most controversial press baron of his day. And it was from this study that his tentacles reached out into the corridors of power. It was from here that he dictated what his newspapers should say, gossiped about who was up, who was down, plotted who to back and who to undermine. And he was quite honest about the purpose of his papers. They were to peddle his propaganda. And he relished causing big trouble for anybody who crossed him.
I'm not late, am I? I'm never late. I've come a long way. From a beautiful little village on the banks of a river in the Canadian province of New Brunswick.
At first glance, you might think he was a bit unprepossessing. He wasn't very handsome. Certainly in old age, he had a rather shrunken, wizened look, but he radiated energy. He was sort of fireball of energy, and he was above all a lot of fun. And he used to tell me, stir up mischief in your life. I advise you to stir up a lot of mischief.
Mischief was what made Beaverbrook tick. He arrived in Britain from his native Canada in 1910 as Max Aitken, already a self-made man and a millionaire before he was 30. Now he set about buying influence. He quickly became a Conservative MP. The following year he was knighted and bought his first stake in the Daily Express. By 1916 he had been given a peerage and became Lord Beaverbrook. The newly ennobled Aitken began to use the Express for his own ends. He hired and fired editors and staff, dictated its line on the great political issues of the day, and packed it full of gossip and intrigue. The public loved it, and the Express circulation soared during the 1920s. Beaverbrook also snapped up the London Standard and launched the Sunday Express. This stable of newspapers made him a power to be reckoned with, but those in power saw him as a dangerous loose cannon.
He divided people by his political views and the vigour with which he expressed them. The Daily Express was never for one moment a dull newspaper. It was really magnificently edited and presented and colourful in its phraseology. It was very much his paper. Of course, when you exercise that degree of newspaper power at a time when newspapers really were the only source of media power, you make friends, but you also make enemies, and he had plenty of both.
Beaverbrook's most unlikely enemy was the Conservative Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, normally a mild-mannered country gentleman. When he came to power in 1924, he was a man on a mission.
When Baldwin came into power, one of his chief aims was to raise the tone of public life, and an immediate issue was the power of the press in Downing Street. They'd had easy entry in the times of Lloyd George, and Baldwin's sense of what was right and wrong, straightforward as that, as well as obvious practical politics, made him say, well, it's time to clean out the stables, and once they're clean, I'm not letting them get dirty again. I mean, he said that more than once. And so they were promptly shown the door.
Beaverbrook and Baldwin loathed each other, and Baldwin rather felt that he could go on governing the country without the advice of these press lords, thank you very much. And the fact he didn't kowtow to the press lords at all infuriated the press lords to a considerable extent, so their attacks became more ferocious.
The battle between Baldwin and Fleet Street's press barons was about to get very personal indeed. Alongside Beaverbrook stood Viscount Rothermere, brother of Northcliffe, now proprietor of the Daily Mail. Beaverbrook and Northcliffe had been rivals. They were now united in a common cause.
This is the old Express building in Fleet Street. It's more than just an office. It's a temple to the power of Beaverbrook and his newspapers. In the early 1930s, when this was just being built, Beaverbrook entered the political fight of his career. He and his newspapers mounted a massive campaign for free trade within the British Empire. It meant that countries like Britain, Australia, Canada could trade freely with each other without paying tariffs or taxes. Now, in today's age of globalization, that may sound a bit mundane, but at the time, it was dynamite. And for Beaverbrook, empire free trade became a crusade.
Beaverbrook set about doing what he did best, stirring up trouble. He founded his own political party, the Empire Party. He fielded his own candidates against conservatives, and he put an empire crusader on the masthead of the Daily Express.
I am the leader of the Empire Free Trade Section. For my part,
His aim was to change the policy on empire free trade and get rid of Stanley Baldwin.
achieving it rather than do without Empire Free Trade.
Beaverbrook and Rothermere pursued Baldwin relentlessly in the Mail and the Express. They suggested he wasn't up to the job, that he'd wasted his family's fortune. The Mail even proposed Beaverbrook as an alternative prime minister. It all came to a head in 1931 when Beaverbrook's party fielded a candidate against the Tories in the Westminster by-election. The press barons were taking on Baldwin in his own backyard.
Baldwin finally snapped. In a famous speech, he borrowed a line from his cousin, who just happened to be the poet Rudyard Kipling. He said that newspaper proprietors, like Beaverbrook, were seeking to exercise power without responsibility, the prerogative of the harlot throughout the ages.
A great work of reconstruction.
To compare anyone to a harlot, a prostitute, that they were prostituting their art, and particularly coming from him, it produced shockwaves. Reports have it that the press people listening to that looked up and jumped, and their pencils almost jumped off the page when he said that.
Baldwin won the by-election. Beaverbrook and Rothermere had suffered a famous defeat. The empire cause never recovered.
Beaverbrook did think of himself as a political failure, and that was because he had failed at the great cause of his life. He always regretted that.
In later years, the crusader on the front of the Express would be shown in chains, a reminder of the failure of its owner's great campaign. Beaverbrook licked his wounds, but he had lived to fight another day. His great empire campaign had flopped, but his newspapers went from strength to strength. By the end of the 1930s, the Daily Express was the biggest selling and most influential paper in Britain. As the 1930s progressed, the great issue of the day became the growing threat from Nazi Germany. Here again, Beaverbrook was to demonstrate an unerring ability to get it wrong.
There'll be no war in Europe. There can be no reason for any outbreak of hostilities among the great powers. All the nations desire peace, and that includes Germany and Italy.
Yet when the Second World War started and Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, Beaverbrook's time had come again. The two men had been friends for more than 30 years.
Churchill and Beaverbrook were drawn to each other. They were both sparkling conversationalists, enjoyed each other's company, both had tremendous command of the English language. And they were kindred spirits because they had many of the same friends. They didn't really like the Tory party and its old-fashioned Knights of the Shires and rather pompous country gentlemen. They were the Buccaneers.
In May 1940, Churchill brought the buccaneering Beaverbrook into the government as Minister of Aircraft Production. It was a critical job. The Battle of Britain was underway, and Britain needed Spitfires, a lot and fast.
Beaverbrook was a pivotal figure in World War II, and Beaverbrook rallied the aircraft production machinery of Britain like a sort of pirate, seizing factories, ordering people about. He dispensed immediately with all the committees, saying, committees take the punch out of war, that was his phrase, I will run this myself. And everybody in the factories, in the supply chain, felt they had to get Spitfires built, and they were built in the nick of time.
Churchill had finally harnessed his great friend's restless energy. He would later write of Beaverbrook's time as a minister, "This was his hour. His personal force and genius swept aside many obstacles." But the end of the war would see Beaverbrook's personal influence begin to decline. Although his paper still thrived, Beaverbrook retreated to Cherkley and was given to reminiscing about happier times. Though he remained a provocative and divisive figure to the end of his life, he was the press baron who had most successfully combined politics and newspapers.